I never imagined life would spiral this way, but here I am, standing in front of an old, narrow building on the edge of town. After losing my job, my savings evaporated, leaving me scrambling for anything I could afford. All my family and friends lived too far away, and I couldn't bring myself to ask for help. I was on my own, forced to sell most of my belongings and leave the house I could no longer pay for. That's how I ended up here. The apartment looked too good to be true. Rent so cheap it almost seemed like a joke, but I didn't have the luxury to question it. When I first stepped into the building, I noticed how cold and quiet it was, the kind of silence that presses in on you, making you feel like you're being watched. The landlord was an old man, his eyes sunken, like he hadn't slept in years. He handed me a single key and a folded piece of paper, barely speaking a word. "Rules," he muttered before walking away. I didn't think much of it at the time. Lots of places had rules, but later, as I unpacked the few things I had left, I decided to read them. There were 6 of them, strange, cryptic rules that made my skin crawl just reading them. Rule 1. Every now and then, you'll hear the hum of an old radio playing from the ceiling. You must lie down flat on the floor and cover your ears until the hum stops. If you ignore it, the station will start broadcasting voices, your voice, repeating things you've said in the apartment. Rule 2. Once in a while, you will hear the sound of soft crying coming from the closet. Do not open the closet door, no matter how human or familiar the voice sounds. If you do, you will see a person you recognize curled up in the corner, weeping. However, this person will not be who they seem. They will beg you to let them out. If you do, the real version of that person will disappear from your life forever. Rule 3. If you find a light bulb flickering in any room after 11 p.m., you must unscrew it immediately. Leave the bulb outside your apartment door before midnight. If the light remains on after midnight, it means something has attached itself to the light source. If you don't remove the bulb in time, it will watch you all night, and you'll start to see it in reflections, always in the background, getting closer. Rule 4. Sometimes at 3:13 a.m., you'll hear a soft scratching at your bedroom door. Do not investigate. Do not open the door. The scratching will continue for precisely 13 minutes. If you try to listen closely, you'll hear a faint whisper calling your name. If you open the door before 3:26, something from the darkness will come inside and you won't be able to get rid of it. Rule 5. If you hear music playing from the apartment across the hall after midnight, do not open your door. The melody will seem familiar, perhaps even comforting, but do not give in to curiosity. The longer you listen, the more likely you'll hear footsteps approaching from your hallway. If the music suddenly stops, you must immediately check that your door is locked and stay silent until sunrise. Rule 6. Every Friday night, the power will go out for exactly 7 minutes at 1 a.m. During this time, you may hear breathing or see movement in the darkness. Under no circumstances should you light a candle, use a flashlight, or attempt to leave the apartment. Stay perfectly still and it will pass. First, I laughed it off. What kind of place has rules like these? They felt more like a joke or some weird tradition passed down by superstitious landlords. Still, I couldn't afford to lose this apartment, and a part of me felt a strange unease, like maybe it wouldn't hurt to follow the rules just in case. The first night was quiet. The apartment was small, just a 1-bedroom unit with a worn-out couch, a rickety dining table, and creaky wooden floors. I could hear the faint hum of the city outside, but inside, it felt like a different world, detached from everything. Then the second night came, and that's when things started happening. I had just gotten into bed when I heard it. a faint hum, like an old radio playing somewhere above me. My heart skipped a beat. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was just my imagination, maybe a neighbor's television or something. But it grew louder, more distinct, like the crackle of an old radio signal trying to come through. My stomach dropped as I remembered Rule 1. I quickly lay flat on the floor, hands over my ears, heart pounding in my chest. The hum continued for what felt like forever, but finally, it stopped. I stayed on the floor for a long time afterward, too afraid to move, too afraid to hear my own voice coming from the ceiling. The next day, I felt ridiculous, embarrassed that I had actually followed the rule, but I didn't want to test what might happen if I didn't. That night, the closet cried. It was soft at first, like a distant sobbing that gradually grew louder, closer. I froze in place, staring at the closet door, my heart racing. It sounded like a woman, her voice cracking with sadness, and for a moment, I almost convinced myself it was someone real, someone in pain. My hand reached for the doorknob, ready to help whoever was inside. But then I remembered the rule. I yanked my hand back, my skin crawling with dread. The crying continued, desperate and familiar, but I stayed frozen, eyes locked on the door until the crying finally faded. The next few days passed uneventfully, but the tension never left. The apartment was quiet, too quiet, as if the building was holding its breath, waiting. On Friday, I prepared for Rule 6. I stayed awake until 1 a.m., bracing myself for the power outage. When the lights cut out, the apartment was plunged into complete darkness. I sat still on the couch, every muscle tense, listening. At first, it was silent, but then I heard it. A faint, raspy breathing, like something standing just out of sight in the darkness. My skin prickled as I fought the urge to light a candle, to see what was breathing so close to me. I stayed perfectly still, counting the seconds, praying for the lights to come back on. When they did, the breathing stopped, and the room returned to its eerie, oppressive quiet. That's when I started to understand the rules weren't just weird superstitions. They were real, and they were keeping me alive. The next week, I made a mistake. It was late, past 11 p.m., and I noticed the light bulb in the kitchen flickering. I was exhausted, barely thinking, and I forgot about Rule 3. I left the bulb in the socket, brushing it off as nothing. That night, I woke up to a strange sensation, like I was being watched. My skin crawled as I glanced around the room, and that's when I saw it. In the reflection of the darkened window, something standing behind me. It was blurry, just a shadow at first, but it grew more defined the longer I stared. It didn't move, but I knew it was watching me, waiting. I bolted upright, my breath catching in my throat. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. From that moment on, I made sure to follow every rule meticulously, but the damage was done. Once you break a rule, the apartment remembers, and it doesn't forgive easily. The shadows stayed with me, always lurking in the corners of my vision, never getting closer but never leaving. I was constantly on edge, the dread building with each passing day. Then came Rule 4. It was 3:13 a.m., and I woke to the sound of soft scratching at my bedroom door. My heart raced as I lay there, counting the seconds, trying to ignore the noise. But then, just as the scratching stopped, I heard it, a whisper, faint but clear, calling my name. My body went cold. I knew better than to open the door, but the voice was so familiar, so tempting. It whispered again, pleading this time, and I felt my hand twitch toward the doorknob. I clenched my fists, fighting the urge, waiting until the clock hit 3:26 before I finally exhaled. The whispering stopped, but the feeling of something lurking on the other side of the door never left. I was losing sleep, losing my grip on reality. I started to wonder if I could keep doing this, if living in this apartment was worth it. But I had no choice. I had nowhere else to go. The rules were the only thing keeping me safe, but they were also slowly driving me insane. One night, after a long week of restless nights and terrifying encounters, I heard music playing from the apartment across the hall. It was soft at first, a gentle melody that felt oddly comforting, like a song from my childhood. I stood frozen in the hallway, listening as the music grew louder. I knew Rule 5, knew I shouldn't open the door, but I couldn't help myself. My hand reached for the lock, and before I knew it, I was standing at the threshold, staring into the dark hallway. The music stopped. My heart leaped into my throat as I quickly locked the door and backed away, every muscle in my body tense. I stood there in the silence, waiting, listening for footsteps. None came, but I could feel something, like a presence just outside, watching, waiting for me to slip up. I spent the rest of the night in my bed, wide awake, gripping the sheets with white knuckles. I thought that was the worst of it, that nothing could top the terror of almost breaking Rule 5. But I was wrong. That was only the beginning. The apartment had grown darker, the shadows longer, like the space itself was shrinking around me, tightening, suffocating. One night, after a long, grueling day of trying to get back on my feet, I saw it. It started with the flickering light bulb again. I immediately remembered Rule 3, but this time I acted quickly, unscrewing the bulb and throwing it outside the door before midnight. I felt a small sense of relief as I watched it roll into the hallway. But as I turned to go back inside, I saw a figure in the reflection of the hallway mirror. It wasn't just a shadow this time. It was tall, much taller than any human, and its limbs were elongated, almost spider-like. Its head was tilted at an unnatural angle, and though I couldn't see its face clearly, I felt its gaze pierce through me. My blood ran cold. I slammed the door shut, locking it as fast as I could, but I knew it was still out there, watching, waiting. That night, I barely slept. The following week was hell. I could feel the apartment turning against me, the air growing thick with tension, like something was just beneath the surface, ready to break through. The crying from the closet returned, more frequent and more desperate. It was louder now, and sometimes it was accompanied by scratching, like someone or something trying to claw its way out. Each time, the voice sounded more familiar, like someone I knew, pleading with me to let them out. I stayed strong, refusing to open the door, but the temptation grew with each passing night. I could almost see their face behind the door, distorted and twisted with sorrow, their eyes hollow but staring right at me through the wood. One night, the scratching at my bedroom door came again at exactly 3:13 a.m., as it always did. This time, though, the whisper calling my name was different, more urgent, more commanding. I lay there in bed, stiff as a corpse, resisting the overwhelming urge to get up and open the door. But something inside me cracked. Maybe it was the weeks of sleepless nights, the constant terror gnawing at my mind, but I couldn't resist anymore. My hand reached out, slowly, almost on its own, toward the doorknob. Just as my fingers brushed the cool metal, I snapped back to reality, pulling my hand away and bolting out of bed. I checked the time, 3:25 a.m. One more minute. I forced myself to sit on the floor, staring at the door, heart pounding, as the last seconds ticked by. At 3:26 a.m., the whisper stopped and the scratching ceased. I had almost broken that rule, but I knew that whatever was on the other side of that door was still there, waiting for me to slip up. The next few days were a blur. I was exhausted, barely eating, barely functioning. I could feel the apartment closing in on me, the rules suffocating me. But I knew I had to keep going, had to survive. Then came Friday night, and with it, Rule 6. I had been dreading this night all week, the thought of the power going out and whatever lurked in the darkness breathing down my neck. At exactly 1 a.m., the lights went out, plunging the apartment into pitch blackness. I sat perfectly still on the couch, my muscles tense, waiting. The air felt heavy, like something was pressing down on me. And then I heard it, the breathing. It was closer this time, much closer than it had been before. I could almost feel it against my skin, a cold, raspy exhale that sent shivers down my spine. I clenched my fists, forcing myself to stay still, not daring to move or make a sound. The breathing circled me, slow and deliberate, like whatever was in the darkness was toying with me, enjoying my fear. I felt something brush against my arm, something cold and wet. I wanted to scream, to run, but I couldn't. I was trapped in the dark with it. I counted the seconds, praying for the power to come back. When the lights finally flickered on, the room was empty, but the feeling of being watched lingered. That was when I realized that these entities, whatever they were, weren't just bound to the rules. They were growing bolder, more dangerous. They wanted me gone, or worse, they wanted me to stay forever. I thought about leaving, about running far away from this cursed apartment, but I couldn't. I had nowhere to go, no money to escape. The apartment had me trapped, and the rules were the only thing keeping me alive. I tried to follow them as perfectly as I could, but the toll it was taking on me was unbearable. My mind was unraveling, fraying at the edges. One night, after another week of strange occurrences, I broke down. The crying from the closet was louder than ever, and it sounded like my mother. Her voice, so familiar, so pained, begged me to open the door. I knew it wasn't her. She was in a better place now. I knew what the rules said, but I couldn't take it anymore. I needed to see her. I stood in front of the closet door, my hand trembling as I reached for the handle. The crying stopped abruptly, replaced by a heavy silence. I hesitated, my heart pounding, but something in me snapped, and I yanked the door open. There, curled up in the corner, was my mother, or at least it looked like her. She was sobbing, her face buried in her hands, her body shaking with grief. I stepped closer, but as I did, something was off. Her sobs didn't sound right. They were too rhythmic, too calculated. She lifted her head slowly, and I froze. Her eyes were hollow, black voids, and her mouth twisted into a grotesque smile. "You shouldn't have done that," she whispered, her voice a strange mix of my mother's and something much darker. I slammed the door shut, backing away in horror, but it was too late. The entity had taken her place. That night, I didn't sleep, couldn't. I sat in the living room, staring at the door, waiting for whatever was going to happen next. The apartment was no longer just a place to live. It was a prison, and I was its prisoner, trapped by the rules I had broken. I knew the entities wouldn't stop now. They would come for me one by one, testing my resolve, pushing me to the edge. But I wasn't ready to give up yet. I had to survive, had to escape, even if it meant facing the darkness head-on. I just didn't know how much longer I could hold on. The days blurred together after that. The radio hum returned, louder and more frequent. but I followed Rule 1 religiously, lying flat on the floor and covering my ears until the noise stopped. I couldn't risk hearing my own voice, couldn't let the apartment twist my words into something sinister. The flickering light bulb returned, too, but I always made sure to unscrew it and throw it out before midnight. Yet the shadows never left. They were always there, lurking just out of sight, waiting for their chance. Then, one final night, the music started again. This time, though, it wasn't soft or comforting. It was loud, blaring from the apartment across the hall, and it wasn't a melody I recognized. It was distorted, like someone had taken a familiar tune and twisted it into something grotesque. I stood at my door, hand on the lock, heart pounding in my chest. I knew I couldn't open the door. I knew I couldn't break Rule 5 again. But the footsteps came anyway. Slow, deliberate footsteps echoed through the hallway, growing louder, closer. I backed away from the door, fear gripping my throat, but the footsteps stopped right outside. There was a long pause and then 3 slow knocks. I held my breath, refusing to make a sound. The knocks came again, louder this time, more insistent. The door shook with the force of them, but I stayed silent, praying that it would go away. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the knocking stopped. The silence that followed was almost worse, but I didn't dare move until sunrise. When I finally unlocked the door the next morning, there was nothing there, just the empty hallway. But I knew it wasn't over. The apartment wasn't done with me yet, and deep down, I wasn't sure it ever would be. I knew I couldn't keep living like this, but I had no choice. The rent was dirt cheap, and I had nowhere else to go. The entities were getting bolder, and the rules felt like a noose tightening around my neck. But I held on night after night, following the rules as best as I could. Each rule had its own terror attached, and each mistake felt like it brought me closer to some horrible end. The nights grew colder, the apartment darker, and the sense of dread followed me everywhere, even in my dreams. Then one night it all came to a head. The radio hum started up again, louder than ever, vibrating the walls, but this time I hesitated. I was so tired, so utterly drained. My mind frayed from weeks of paranoia and fear. Instead of lying flat on the floor as I always had, I just sat there, staring at the ceiling, listening. I knew I was breaking Rule 1, but something in me wanted to know, wanted to hear what the voices would say. And then, sure enough, my own voice came through the static, repeating conversations I'd had in the apartment. At first, it was just the mundane things. Talking on the phone to my landlord, cursing the broken kitchen sink. But then, it began to say things I had never said. My voice, only it wasn't mine anymore, was whispering things too low to understand, but I knew whatever it was saying was meant for me. I snapped out of my daze and threw myself to the floor, covering my ears, heart racing, but the damage was done. The voices faded, but I felt different. Something had shifted. The air was heavier, the walls seemed to close in, and I knew I had invited something in. The next night, the apartment was silent, unnervingly so. No humming radio, no flickering lights, no crying from the closet. I almost thought, for a brief moment, that it was over. Maybe the entities had finally grown bored of me. But then the power went out at exactly 1 a.m. I knew what that meant. Rule 6 was in play. I sat still on the couch as I always did, but this time the breathing was different. It wasn't just in the darkness. It was right behind me. I could feel it, cold and rasping, like icy fingers trailing down my neck. My entire body went rigid, and I gripped the couch, every muscle screaming at me to run, but I couldn't move. I didn't dare move. The breathing grew louder, more labored, and then I felt it. Something touched my shoulder. Cold, skeletal hand. I bit down on my lip, holding back a scream, forcing myself to stay perfectly still. My mind raced, and I counted the seconds, praying for the power to return. When the lights finally flickered back on, I was alone again. The cold hand was gone, but the fear lingered like a shadow over me. I knew then that I couldn't stay any longer. The apartment had given me enough warnings, and I had been foolish enough to break the rules. The entities had grown too close, too real. I was in their world now, and they wanted me to stay. I packed my things the next day, throwing clothes and whatever little I owned into a suitcase. I didn't care where I would go, just that I had to leave. The last night in the apartment, the silence was deafening. No rules activated, no strange noises, just a stillness that felt almost oppressive. I didn't sleep. I sat in the living room, staring at the door, waiting for something, anything, to happen, but nothing did. The next morning, I walked out of that apartment for the last time, leaving the key behind. As I closed the door, I felt a strange weight lift off my shoulders, like I had narrowly escaped something far worse than I could ever imagine. I didn't look back. As I walked down the hallway, passing the other doors, I noticed something odd. The apartment across the hall, the one with the music that had nearly driven me insane, had no number. In fact, it looked like it had been abandoned for years. The paint was peeling, the door was rotting, and there was no sign of life. A chill ran down my spine, but I kept walking, refusing to let my mind linger on it. I stepped out into the daylight, breathing in the fresh air, feeling alive for the first time in weeks. I had made it. I had survived. But as I walked away from the building, I couldn't shake the feeling that the apartment wasn't done with me. It had let me go, for now, but I knew that somewhere, somehow it was still watching, waiting.